Hey, Captain Tommy Derringer here for the Florida Insider Fishing Report. For the Northeast region, we're going to do a little video report today, obviously. And today is Saturday, December the 7th. Man, we've had some fantastic fishing going on throughout the entire region, really for the past few weeks. But this past week was really something special. The weather was perfect. We had light winds, plenty of sunshine. It was chilly. A couple of days, it never got out of the 50s, but man, it had the redfish really fired up. They were up shallow, eating all kinds of stuff, doing all kinds of crazy redfish things like they do this time of year. But we also have a great trout bite happening, and some sheepshead are starting to show up in better numbers, and there's still some flounder around. So I'm going to talk about all that stuff today. Let's start with the trout. You know, trout bite's been really consistent for probably the last month or so, as it usually is this time of year. As things cool down, those trout start to school up. A lot of the trout right now are in that 14 to 16 inch range, but there's some bigger ones up to 18, even some 20 inchers hanging in there as well. Now, for me, this past week, I was fishing early on that outgoing tide early in the morning. It was chilly, but the trout were still hitting top waters and some suspending plugs. Now, coming up next week, that tide is going to be a little later in the day. Midday, then kind of going towards 3 or 4 in the afternoon towards the end of the week. So later in the day, probably not going to be the best time to toss the top water for those trout. So I'm going to be tossing a soft plastic on a jig head. It's a super simple rig. It's a saltwater assassin. This is called the Lil Boss paddle tail. I rig it on a 1/4 ounce jig head, and you can toss this along any of the shell bars from Ponce Inlet all the way up through Jacksonville, any of the shell bars along the intercoastal on that outgoing tide. Look for those shell bars. If you see some bait, that's even better, but really any of those oyster bars right along the ditch, they're gonna be holding some trout right now. Now, if you don't like to throw the plastic stuff, of course you can throw a live shrimp on a 1/4 ounce jig head or put a live shrimp under a float. And they've also been eating the mud minnows pretty good as well. And there's some big mud minnows at all the area tackle stores right now. Some of the biggest mud minnows I've ever seen. So that's the trout side of things. You know, the sheepshead, that sheepshead bite has been pretty good. I've got a couple of good reports from Jacksonville. The guys that are scraping the barnacles and the oysters off the bridges are doing well, but they're also catching them along the jetties out at Mayport. They're catching them at the jetties here in St. Augustine and down in Ponce as well. But you can pretty much set up on any crusty old dock, piling, or bridge right now with some fiddler crabs, and you're probably going to find some sheepshead. There's been some pretty big ones around. My buddy Jimmy from Jacksonville sent me a picture yesterday. He had a couple that were in that 8-pound range. So some big fish around. Seems like those sheepshead bite best when the tide's moving. Doesn't seem to really matter that much if it's high or low, incoming or outgoing, but they do like it to be moving. But you do want to use some fairly light tackle for those guys so you can feel the bite. As everybody knows, those guys are really tough to catch if you've never done it before, because they tend to bite really soft. So you got to be pretty quick with those guys. But anyhow, that sheepshead bite is good throughout the region. Look forward to get better as things continue to cool down, although I think it is going to warm up a little bit this coming week. Anyways, let's move on to redfish. That's what I'm excited to talk about. The redfish bite has been really good this past week. Man, we had 3 or 4 days of just perfect sight fishing conditions. Plenty of sunshine. Yes, it was cold, but you know what? The cold weather, those cold air temperatures brings that water temperature down. And when that water temperature gets down to around 60 degrees, which it has been, the brown algae starts to die off and that water clears up. So water has been nice and clear, pretty much from Jacksonville all the way down through the whole region. It's been a little clear in some areas than others, but it's definitely sight fishable. Those cooler water temperatures also have the redfish schooled up. So if you're in Jacksonville and St. Augustine and you've got a skinny water boat or a kayak, get to the very backs of any of those creeks, any of the bigger creeks, get to the very back of those creeks at low tide, and you're going to find some redfish feeding. If you're in the right creek, you're probably going to find a big school of redfish. I was in a couple on Tuesday and Wednesday this week where we found probably close to 100 fish schooled up in the very backs of those creeks, and they're actually absolutely gorging themselves on these little tiny minnows and some small mullet that are in those creeks. And I've been tossing, when we've been sight fishing, I've been tossing this saltwater assassin sea shad We've been using it in a couple different colors. I think this is the Mama's 14K. Looks just like those little minnows and those little mullet that are in those creeks. And I've paired up with a 16th ounce weedless jig, or excuse me, a weedless hook. This is a great hook to make a gentle presentation, which you need to do when you're sight fishing in clear water. When it's calm winds and sunny, those fish are going to be a little spooky. So this rig right here is probably my all-time favorite sight fishing rig. It's super simple. If you get this near the redfish and wiggle it, they're going to eat it. When we have been blind casting, I've been throwing a little bigger paddle tail, the Saltwater Assassin Low Boss. Same rig. You know, I like to rig and weedless because of all the oysters we have, but this one's got an 1/8 ounce weight instead of the 16th, so you can cast it a little further. But those redfish right now, they're fired up. Get out there at low tide. Trust me on this one, if the weather's decent, you're gonna see some redfish busting some bait, and you're probably gonna see them laid up if the water's clear enough for us this coming week. Now that tide is the low tide is gonna be a little later in the day of this coming week, so you can sleep in a little bit. But I think, again, those fish are gonna be fired up. You're gonna be warmed up at the end of the day on that low tide. So definitely get in those creeks and check it out. You also wanna hit the edges of the intercoastal, the edges of any big flats. On low tide, those fish are pushing out and schooling up there as well. Now moving on to the offshore side of things, I've had a few reports, not a whole lot of guys getting out there, which is pretty normal for this time of year. But the guys that have been going out there, they're doing really good on the wahoo. Not big numbers, but they're catching them. It seems like everybody that's gone has been catching a few. If anybody catches any this week and they want to bring me a few fillets, that would be cool. But they're also catching some tuna fish out near the stream and some sailfish as well. So it's a good mixed bag of trolling out of St. Augustine right now, near the Gulf Stream, near the ledge. But the bottom fishing's been good too. Got a couple good reports on the trigger fish, that 120 to 140 foot range. Guys are loading up, probably 3 or 4 boats at the dock yesterday on Friday, that limited out on triggerfish, and they were pretty good sized ones. So, hey, if anybody's got a few extra triggerfish, you can bring me some of those fillets as well. Those are delicious. But there's also some grouper around. So the guys from the Angry Seas went out. Captain Gibb went out a couple days ago and caught a couple nice big grouper in pretty shallow. So colder waters bringing them in a little bit. And of course, there's pretty much all the red snapper you can catch. So good mixed bag offshore, great inshore fishing we got going on right now. So you know what, if you get a chance, get out there and catch them up.